Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. In this last episode before a brief summer break, I want to finish with a discussion on software management plans. The occasion for that came up with a workshop on the subject which was held near Paris in France at the end of May this year, 2024. The event was organized by my friend Teresa Gomez-Diaz, who some of you might remember from previous episodes. Teresa works at the Laboratory Gaspard Monge, or otherwise known as LIGM, which itself is part of the French National Research Centre, the CNRS. To organize the event, she got help from Pascal Monas and Mathieu Hefele, two other researchers and research engineers. And you will hear from Pascal and Mathieu a little bit later, as well as from one of the participants, Ghislain Veillon, and Teresa herself, of course. But back to the training course. When I got to the workshop on a Thursday morning, the 22nd of May, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. To be honest, software management plans haven't been exactly on my radar up to that point, neither in the private sector or indeed in academia. I may not be alone in this, as you will hear a little bit later. I have been aware of data management plans, and in fact, many universities, organizations, and research centers require researchers to provide one for their projects. Not to mention funding agencies, of course. There are legal reasons for that, not least the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, but also other and more specific ones like, for instance, patient and medical data used in research. On top of that, there is the fact that data, as research artifacts, need to be maintained and cared for if they were to be accessible and findable for further research. None of that runs on autopilot, so planning for that makes good sense on that account alone. But software? Do I really need a plan for that little Python script which I developed and which I use in my data analysis? And what would I put in such a plan, and where would I keep it? It was in 2016 that the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK published a paper on software management plans for the first time, with a later revision in 2018, where they wanted to address some of these questions, like why it might be useful to have such a plan in the first place. A software management plan, it says, and I'm quoting, can help you to define a set of structures and goals to understand your research software, including what you are going to develop, who the software is for, even if it's just yourself, how you will deliver your software to its intended users, how it will help them, and how you will assess whether it has helped them and contributed to research in the ways that you intended. Well, so far so good, and all of that sounds reasonable, except that you may not know at the beginning who the software will be for, apart from yourself and your teammates, of course. Will it ever leave the lab? Will it be used by other researchers? And how would it help them? When you start on your research software, that's often difficult and maybe even impossible to know. Which brings me to Pascal Monas, who works at the Gaspard Monge laboratory near Paris and who was one of the co-organizers of this event. We met right at the start of the workshop, and Pascal was wondering exactly how a software management plan can help researchers. So here's Pascal.
I'm Pascal Monas, and I'm a researcher in computer vision at the laboratory that is called LIGM, Laboratoire d'Informatique Gaspard Monge. I've been here for 15 years. And before that, I did my PhD in Paris, and then I spent 6 years in the US in a private company, working on video processing and working mainly for the police enforcement and forensics.
Okay. Well, that is an entire different episode, I think, because it would be interesting.
Completely.
You're one of the organizers of this workshop on planning software or software plans. What made you decide to join this workshop and help out organizing?
Well, to say the truth, I don't have much experience with software planning and making plans on research software especially. But, well, it's Teresa that convinced me that it would be a good idea to organize that. And I agreed because I think I'm curious, actually. I want to learn what are the benefits of planning research software. And to say the truth, I'm still a bit skeptical. But
okay,
I will see what comes out of the impression of the participants, and maybe it's forced to ask good questions about what we want from the software and what we intend to do with it.
Your skepticism, what is it? Where do you think it's difficult, or
because I think that making plans is always difficult, of course, making prediction of where we'll go. Well, we can have objectives, of course, but I think that when it concerns research software, it's even more difficult because we don't know most of the time when I begin some software, I don't plan in advance where it will go, what it will be later. I have to ask a specific task. It's a close objectives. I don't intend it to go bigger than that, usually. Of course, it can happen after, but it's difficult to plan in advance. I prefer going straight. I have a few ideas and I want to test them, and that's where I start the research software. And if I find that it could be useful for also other objectives, then fine. But planning in advance, I mean, maybe it's too difficult for me.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question because in research, as you say, you often don't know in advance where the software goes. You may write a script and it turns out into this massive program that everybody uses. Or you can write a very complicated algorithm and nobody uses it.
Yes.
And you don't know. What would convince you to use software plans if you're skeptical at the moment?
If I find that it's more than just administrative chores, if it really helps me to have ideas how to develop the software, how to disseminate it, and how make it useful to people, then I would consider it. And of course, I know that it is required for some fundings and project goals. But for me, at this point, it's more administrative stuff than really useful for me for research as a researcher.
Okay, so there is some convincing then to be done.
Yes, still, but we have still time.
We were in the middle
and
of
it
the
may come up later that I realize later than, yes, actually it was a good idea to plan in advance, but I'm still a bit skeptical.
One of the aspects of the plan was a license and the use of license.
Yes.
And I know that we had a long discussion yesterday about licensing. I find it very confusing. So how do you approach licensing with the software that you write?
Typically, I use mainly two licenses. Can be GPL, the GNU Public License, or Mozilla Public License. It's roughly the same, but it's a bit different because Mozilla Public License, it says it's more granular. It says for each file, you have this license and it's written and it's limited to the file. Whereas for GPL, it's global to the software. It says all the software is the set of files. And it's a bit unclear how you can mix that with other stuff. It's a bit more flexible with Mozilla Public License. But it's mainly my first reflex is to go to that license because I'm used to it. But of course, it can change if I have collaborators and they convince me that it is better to change the license, who are still owners of the software. We have the copyright of the software, so it's not a hassle to change the license. As long as it's not, after that, when you have many contributors, then it's too late. You can change the license after that. But before, when it's your own software and you don't care, I want still people to have the possibility to use it and change it if they want. So I keep something open as possible. But of course, if people, for example, I had some question about recently from some software I did, the original license was GPL. The guy was working in a private company and he said, okay, if it's GPL, I can't not use it because, of course, all the software should be GPL and they don't want to do that in a company. So they asked if I can change that to another license, which is LGPL. LGPL is library GPL. You can mix it with proprietary software. And this one, I had no trouble with that. I said, okay, no problem. I can change the license. And I did.
Does the university actually tell you what license to take? Does the
No,
university
the university
limit?
doesn't tell us what to use. They expect us to use one of the public licenses, open licenses that we can have, but they don't say what we have to use. And actually, they are unable to guide us. Even if we had to ask for some advice, I doubt that anybody would be more competent than we are about the licenses to use.
So for the workshop, you already alluded to you're skeptical. So ideally, at the end of this workshop, what would you hope you achieved by then?
I hope to find out that actually doing a plan is a good idea and that it will help having ideas about how to develop the software, how to disseminate it, and how to make it useful to the research community.
Okay, so the workshop started with a number of questions, which is actually a good starting point for some in-depth discussions and meaningful exchange, which in fact we did have. The turnout for the workshop was quite good, with 15 participants from different institutes and institutions in France. The proceedings started with a bunch of presentations, mainly from the organizers, and apart from Pascal and Teresa, that included Mathieu Heffler, who I caught up with in one of the coffee breaks in the morning. So here's Mathieu.
So my name is Mathieu Heffler. I am a research software engineer in Pau, so southwest in France, in lab of mathematics. And yes, I have a PhD in computer science, and I lived among mathematicians and physicists during my career, and I am again with mathematicians, but I'm basically giving support to produce software to make simulation and potentially on high performance computing.
And you're one of the organizers of this workshop here in Paris at the University of Paris Gustave Eiffel. So what made you join this workshop and what do you hope to get out of it?
Yeah, I've been contacted by Teresa, so that's how I joined the organization of the workshop. The past months, years, I got involved in open science issues and trying to propose methods and so on, and trying to improve software quality in the research environment by disseminating good practices and tools that could be helpful, that make life easier. And yes, and so having a plan on software is always a good idea, even if the plan is not respected.
But you have one.
At least you have one, and you have a starting base from which you can evolve later. So that's never a bad idea to get a plan. At least you have a list of things that you can think about on how to improve the management of the software.
Yeah, and I think in your talk you gave a number of examples of why best practices are important, because I think you came to it the hard way. You had some bad experiences. Did you have a paper rejected at some stage? Did I understand that correctly?
Not really. As an engineer, I'm not publishing myself. I'm giving support to scientists that are publishing, definitely.
Yeah.
But I'm not publishing myself. It's only bad experiences on you're doing things and it's worth nothing because it has been abandoned. So that this happened to me.
Yeah.
You work 6 months on the code and yes, the new version of the code is not used. So yes, that's a bit disappointing.
6 months down the drain, basically.
Yes, but yeah, exactly. The biggest challenge I think we are facing is on the human side. So managing people in the team, having that are collaborating towards producing a single software is a challenge. And human aspects of software development are in general underestimated. And this is something that we are not trained at all in our curriculum in general. And that's something that we are learning as we are experiencing. In general, you learn it the hard way.
Well, you certainly learn it when you learn it the hard way. So do you think that software plans then help?
This is the first step. Definitely, at least you have a list of things. And it makes people aware of what should be handled. That's sometimes not the case. Not everybody is aware that, okay, this should be done. And this kind of exercise is a good thing to improve the awareness of everybody in the team that this should be implemented. But it doesn't teach you how to work together.
And if I dare to mention it at this point, even I had a chance to exercise my pidgin French and introduce my work on Code for Thought for a few minutes during the introduction. I confess I was terrified, this being my first presentation in French after all. Luckily, my spot was just before lunch, and with food firmly on the mind of most participants, I got away with it lightly. Anyway, back to the training event. Things started to heat up and get serious after lunch. After all, Teresa gave us an overview on her work on software management plans, and in particular the template for a plan that she created together with a colleague of hers, Geneviève Romier. The template is called Pre-Soft and is available for download, and there is some companion material available on Zenodo, and you can find the link to both in the episode notes. Well, it didn't take long for questions to be raised and discussions to start during Teresa's presentation, because the proposed template contains sections on authorship and intellectual property. A lot of the discussions circled around these areas then. And in the break, I had a chance to talk to one of the participants, Ghislain Vaillant. Ghislain is based at one of the French research centers called INRIA, with an office at the Paris Santé campus south of Paris, INRIA being the French National Institute for Research in Digital Science and Technology. Here's Ghislain.
Hello, Ghislain.
Hello, Peter.
Hello again. And we talked previously in Paris, but this time we're talking about a workshop here at the University of Gustave Eiffel about software management plans.
Yes, amongst many things.
Amongst many things, I know. But how is it going for you so far?
I've learned many things, more than I expected from the schedule of the event, I have to say. The schedule was very packed, I found.
In what way?
In a way that there was a lot of information and things went one after the other with not a lot of breaks to digest the amount of information. But there was a lot of prerequisites necessary to understand software management plans, I think, that we covered during the first half of the first day of the event, which was more than welcome. We talked about first what it meant to be a research software engineer, with the feedback from Mathieu, with this fictive José, a research software engineer, which describes her experience working day to day in a lab. And I think a lot of us in the room could relate to some of the tasks that she had to make, which were to deal with things like intellectual property, software distribution, software optimizations, sometimes dealing with the fact that software projects come and go. I think it was very insightful, and it was very clever to present it that way, just not to come and say, look, my name is X and this is what I've done as a research software engineer, but making it a story with some emphasis on some of these tasks. I think it was very clever. Then we had this sort of exercise, that's collaborative exercise, the whole room.
Afternoon yesterday,
I think, if I remember well, the topic was what defines a research software which is of quality, which is visible and which is sustainable in the long term. And we were divided in groups in 3 to think about it, come up with very specific points that relates to these 3 axes. And then they were organized in sections like documentation, tests, project management, which gave us a sort of an impression of what's the baseline of knowledge on these topics from all of us. And I think all of us came to the same ballpark in all of the attributes.
There was a lot of overlap.
I agree. And that was, I think these 2 parts were the perfect introduction to the meat of the event, which was the software management plan and the questions about intellectual property, software authorship, and how to deal with these in complex collaborative contexts that we can find in research.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to 2 things that I want to mention. First is that you started recently at a different institute, as I remember, and you had to actually go through one of those software management plans.
Initially, it started as me asking for a domain name for the software.
Yeah.
And that triggered a chain of events that led me to actually have to deposit the project for an intellectual property agency, which required that I fill in the equivalent of the software management plan at INRIA, because it's my employer is INRIA. And one of my objectives for coming to this workshop was to evaluate the delta between the software management plan pre-soft that Teresa introduced us and what INRIA provides through this bill, and see how different they were, how similar they were. There's a known fact that the software management plan, they're usually poorly filled in, especially by the scientific staff. And for known reasons, and I understand these reasons after this workshop, because it is a difficult document. It requires a lot of legal knowledge that research staff are either not interested to get or don't get the chance to be exposed to, but they are necessary nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think the intellectual property question and the authorship, I think, is something that occupied us quite a bit because, as you alluded to earlier, that can be quite complex. You have a research team that consists of people working at a particular institute or university. There may be PhD students, there may be interns, there may be international contributors. And so how do you approach that then in terms of authorship, and how do you keep that up to date?
First, Teresa gave us a reminder of what's the definition of software from a legal perspective, and it's actually quite simple. It's essentially an invention, similar to putting content in text or in audio, like this podcast, for instance. It remains an invention. It's just that unlike other inventions where basically all the co-authors have equal shares in terms of intellectual property, it's a more blurry and more difficult calculation.
I saw heads knocked together in tables.
Yes, and if all the contributors of the software are from the same institution, from the same lab, and a reminder of today's session is that a lab is not a legal entity, so copyrighting software to a lab is not appropriate because the lab is not a legal entity. That was one of the major findings, and it's a very known pattern in science today. Yeah. And it is all the more difficult that if you are in a lab like mine, where we have different institutions collaborating together, where you might have past collaborators who were employed temporarily to work on the project and then moved on to somewhere else. They hold copyright of the software, and you need to estimate their share of contribution to the software. So the bottom line of all this is that the software management plan should be dealt with early to avoid the difficulties of producing it at a later time where everyone has gone in different directions, and tracking this information becomes more and more difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's where the problem is, isn't it? Because when you start a new software project in science, you don't really think about, that many people going to be involved. So why would I write a software management plan? Which would be the moment when writing one would probably be very straightforward and easy because there's only one or two people.
The duality of this is that the most appropriate time to write that plan is early when you have no plan.
Okay, yeah.
So as early, you probably have no perspective in mind, but as Teresa mentioned to me today when we were discussing the authorship for the specific piece of software that I'm working on, is that as for any plans, you are basically putting in writing stuff that's going to help you deal with more complicated political and legal aspects of the software if at a later stage the software becomes successful enough that it might become part of a consortium or even part of a business. Today, most of our research institutions are pushing more and more for transfer, so for transferring technology from a research lab to a startup or a company.
Okay, yeah.
So when that time comes, the question of the authorship and the intellectual property rights on the software are going to be major.
Yes, indeed. And you don't want this to be a mess.
Exactly.
Finally, on Monday, after this workshop, you're going back to INRIA, starting your day job. What do you think you're going to do differently after this one?
First of all, I have to correct that copyright line of, of my project, because now I know for sure that it is wrong. And I have the critical piece of knowledge to understand why it is wrong and how to correct it. Another reason I've attended that workshop is because the aim is also to compile all this knowledge and broadcast it at a wider scale at my INRIA center and maybe at INRIA at large. We'll see. But the aim is to definitely make that important piece of knowledge as known as possible to the wider community of research software engineers in France. And I'm also going to try to teach it as much as possible to the rest of the research staff. Some of them are have these questions, and now I'll have more precise answers and more precise pointers. There are still questions that remains unanswered. I raised the question of the authorship and intellectual property of AI-generated code. It's definitely a topic that I'm glad we raised during that event. It's probably the question that I get the most in my lab about.
Because people are using Copilot.
Because people are using more and more these LLMs to generate code. The thing to keep in mind is that it is an ongoing topic, and we need research software engineers to be up to date with the evolutions of the legal framework around code and data produced whilst doing research, and to be up to date with what needs to be done from a legal perspective, from an intellectual property perspective, to just make sure that the research we make can be used forever.
As Ghislain just said, research is often done by a mix of researchers with different backgrounds, different roles, and sometimes coming from different organizations and indeed countries, which means that it's not always easy to assign and partition authorship and contributions. Questions which may become important when it comes to future funding or when the research project is transitioning into a startup, which is in fact something a number of research centers and universities encourage people to do, and not just in France. So software management plans are useful at that point, in particular when the plan covers authors, ownership and licenses, as the proposed plan by Teresa and Geneviève called Presoft does. But when should you start such a plan? Straight away? In the middle of it? As Ghislain said, setting up a software management plan at the start might make things easier. Which brings me finally to Teresa herself, the author of the Presoft plan template. Teresa, of course, had her hands full during the workshop, so we met again after the dust settled a little bit a few days later. In our conversation, Teresa takes us through how the concept for the plan proposal came about and how she thinks it should be used.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this workshop, which was very interesting. And that's what we want to talk about today.
Yes.
Because you created this workshop, or you set it up, you organized it together with other people. What did you want to get out of it, and why did you want to have this workshop?
In fact, the workshop was about research software management plans. And it's a work we did with a colleague, Geneviève Romier, that she's now retired. She was the head of a very little project, 2 years, a project called Presoft, that was in 2018, around 2018. We did this proposition of a research software management plan model. Mostly her, but we did a lot of presentations about this work. Even if you do a lot of presentations, it's something that didn't take in the community. It was not something very well known. We didn't have information about a lot of people using it. We didn't have contact asking for more questions. So it's not something that is easy at the first sight. So no one was contacting us. So then Geneviève went to retirement, and it's something I liked to do with her for a long time. It was not possible. And I liked also to do more plans in my lab. It was the COVID time, so difficult to collaborate with other people. And it was this year, so I was very happy to have the collaborators to organize this workshop, we can say training session. it was very surprising to see also that there was people interested.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, it was quite a good turnout. That was good. I think the idea came from perhaps the research data management plans. Was that the cause of it?
I think so. In fact, it was at the time I was working a lot with Geneviève in projects at a European level. She had the opportunity to ask for some little funding. She got this idea. I say, perfect, very good. And she was a bit the manager of the project. We worked together with other people as well. She got the idea. I think it's very good. At the time, in I don't remember very well the year, 2017, the only software management plan that was more or less well known was the proposition of Software Sustainability Institute. We started to study the work, and we had other view about the research software life cycle, and the importance of, as always, licenses, management. So we worked a lot to build this proposition.
Pre-soft, which is what we discussed at the workshop. Some people may find it difficult because it's quite detailed. So what would you say to the people who say, well, I'm just at the beginning of my project, why do I need to fill out all of these questions?
Not all the questions. Why this proposition can be seen as a bit complex is because we have the document that with the possibility to be started at any moment, not just in the early stage of a project. Obviously, if you start the project and the software management plan at the same time, it's easier. There is a lot of questions, but you don't have answers, and it's not a problem. The important thing is to have the question.
To start thinking about it.
When you start a software project, maybe you don't have any idea if you are going to disseminate it, or what will happen with this project in the next year, or if you will have collaborators or maybe a student to work over the project. So it's a place to put the plan, the ideas. What I would like to do is to have one person to disseminate it as a free software or not, to build this project, to do a publication and then stop. So if you have the questions, you can realize better what you would like or not to be done. And then you see the document next year, and maybe the plan has changed and the vision has changed and you have new goals. This is a help. Or maybe you will like to ask funding. The important thing are the questions.
Looking forward, what are your plans with Pre-soft?
At the moment, what I would like is to do more work with researchers in my lab and outside the lab. When Geneviève went to retirement, I took the responsibility of the project of Pre-soft Research Software Management Plan that is available in a service at the CNRS Institute in East. In fact, they asked to put the plan there, and it's available for everybody. So I took the contact responsibility. If people ask me, I would like help, I will be very, very happy. So work with more people in my lab and see how this proposition evolves. Maybe also to do another workshop or training session, maybe at the university or outside the university, or both. Who knows? I should do a plan for this.
We're going global. Okay. Now that the workshop is over, and we are meeting actually quite a few days afterwards now, here again at the University Gustave Eiffel. So how did it go for you then?
I was surprised.
Oh, okay.
I was surprised because we had a very nice organization team, very motivated, that did so different aspects of research software. And it's important, the public we had are people that are usually in their own lab, working in their own projects. It's not always easy to see other things. So I was surprised because there was a limit of 15 persons, and I didn't know if maybe 5 it was a good idea. You don't know. It's the first time we did this. So, and we got 15 persons very soon, very quickly. I was surprised because the interest because the participation, the motivation to exchange in the questions, everyone was talking, it was too nice. I liked it a lot.
I agree. I think there was quite a lot of good interaction. So what did you learn? What did you take away from this workshop?
What I take away is that the proposition is serious and is considered as serious. There are other propositions, and I told them there are maybe other models which are easier, but they don't deal with the same questions in the same way. We looked to another proposition, and it was more as development plan, no RSE software management plan. There are different visions. In the session where people were filling their own plan, there was a silence. Everyone was working. I think this proposition will help them.
Somewhere in the middle of our conversation, Teresa made the crucial point about the plan. It's not important that you have all the answers for the software management plan. It's the questions that matter. And that also answers my question why it would make sense to create a plan when you start with a research software. Of course, you're not able to complete every single detail of the plan. You're not expected to. The idea is to consider the questions around your software and as a living document to update it as you go along. All of which is aimed to help you when you want to take your software project further, for instance, as a library used by other researchers or even as a commercial product. The catch, of course, is that we have to remember updating the plan whenever there is a change. And in the long list of things researchers have to do, that's not a trivial ask. Of course, some funding agencies or research organizations may require you to provide a software management plan anyway, so having one or not may not be an option available to you. But for the rest of us, this kind of plan offers an opportunity to think about important questions around your software application or library. Many of us already cover some of these questions when we create project and repository services such as GitHub or GitLab, for instance by providing a license file and a README, perhaps even a citation file, which is to say that a software management plan may be implemented perhaps in different ways. After all, as Teresa says, and I'm reiterating, it's the questions that matter. So if this tickles your interest and you want to find out more about software management plans and the Pre-Soft template, you'll find the links in the show notes. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode and indeed the end of this season of Code for Thought. Well, except for one thing, the quiz from the last bite-sized RSE episode. To jog your memory, in the last bite-sized RSE episode we talked about Python packaging. And the two questions I left at the end were, how do you create a Python package with a tool called Poetry? And question number 2, what tool or technique would you use to use different Python versions for different projects? Okay, as for question number 1, with Poetry creating a package is quite simple. And it starts with a command in your terminal, Poetry, new, followed by the name of your package or project. And this creates a folder for you with a basic structure and basic files like the PyProject TOML file that Poetry creates for you. The work doesn't stop there, of course. You still need to customize the PyProject TOML file. For instance, any dependencies you might need to add or any particular Python version you want to use. However, Poetry already provides some details in the file, like the build system it uses to build the package. Of course, if you want to publish your Python package, you need to do some additional stuff. For instance, you'd need to register for PyPy in case that's where you want to publish to, in which case you should also register for test.pypy, which you use to test your package and make sure it works and installs properly before making it available to the world. But assuming you've done all of that and configured Poetry to be able to publish to test.pypy as well as PyPy, publishing a package becomes essentially a 3-step process. First, you start with creating the binaries and source tar with the command Poetry build, which you do in the root folder of your project. Next, you type in Poetry publish -r test.pypy to publish your package to the testing platform first, And once you've tested it and are happy with it, you finish off by simply doing poetry publish from the command line. So now to question number 2. The answer, of course, is virtual environments. These allow you to use different versions of Python and other dependencies for different packages and projects. Virtual environments is indeed a core feature for many managers, including poetry. Okay, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed the episodes from this season, and if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, I hope you'll have a nice summer and perhaps even a break. But no matter where you are in the world, I hope you'll be back for Season 8, which starts on the first Tuesday in September. Finally, you can now message me directly from the show notes. There's a link at the top, and you can also reach me, of course, on LinkedIn, Mastodon, or by good old-fashioned email. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya!